Hello, my name is Danilo Gigito and I am a research associate working on the Hilali network. In this lecture I'm going to be talking about what is intangible cultural heritage, going through the institutional and academic conceptualizations of it, and the way in which the meaning attributed to cultural heritage has been changing and broadening after the word intangible had been introduced into the debate. The first known use of the word heritage was in the 13th century, and it derives from the Old French héritage, meaning inherited property. And so the word originally was a synonym of words such as legacy, inheritance, tradition, and birthright. Its most common definitions are property that descends to a heir, something transmitted by or acquired from a predecessor, or something possessed as a result of one's natural situation or birth. From the 60s, however, the concept of heritage has started to be reconceptualized, acquiring a gradually different and broader meaning by moving away from an idea of mere material transmission towards including cultural elements such as roots, identity, and sense of place and belonging in the most common definition. So heritage has become a mode of cultural production that gives to the old or endangered a second chance to reshow itself or being repurposed. It also helps people to connect with each other through the past by having a common past or common legacy or common origins. Naturally, this reconceptualization has led to a big increase of the worries about protecting cultural heritage. In fact, protection or safeguarding or conservation have become buzzwords associated with heritage. Here I show three very well-known examples of cultural heritage. We have the pyramids in Egypt, the Colosseum in Rome, Italy, or the Stonehenge in England. These are just three examples, and it's pretty known how lots of efforts are put into restoring or preserving these artifacts, and doing vandalism against them is likely to be considered a serious crime. If these sensitivities towards those ancient monuments hadn't been developed, they would have been destroyed by now, if not just for the passing of the time. And this is where heritage becomes cultural. Some people in Italy or Egypt, for instance, can be proud, respectively, of their Roman or pharaonic heritage, and that is one of the ways in which the past can give cultural meaning to people's lives nowadays. So it feels like heritage is becoming more important by the days, and why, one may ask, has cultural heritage become so important in recent times? Even though every country may have its own reasons to celebrate the past, the literature identifies a few common motives and pushing factors that are indeed common among many countries. The first reason, which was thought in the 80s, refers to the fact that fast-paced changes typical of modernity mix with a few radicalizing trends such as the dissolution of traditional families, the refugees diaspora, the rapid obsolescence of products, can lead people to feel unrooted. So these people that feel so may search for a counterbalancing sense of stability and reassurance in the past. In this scenario, heritage may be a counter-response, a countermeasure to insecurity and uncertainty, through which people find a nostalgic reassurance in the good old days. The second reason is pretty much self-explanatory, as commercializing the past brings profit. So one of the main push factors behind the decisions of some states or nations to develop and preserve heritage, for instance by funding museums, is because of the connections with tourism and the income that stems from its commodification. And finally, the last argument refers to nationalism and national identity, which are interwoven with the restoration of cultural heritage, and the celebration of the past through the right cultural artifacts can help the national identity building process. And during this process of heritage ascendancy, we could also witness a parallel process of institutionalization, namely the proliferation of public or private bodies and institutions that deal with cultural heritage on different levels. UNESCO is perhaps the most important and known, and it was founded during the aftermath of World War II to facilitate intellectual cooperation between nations after the disasters of the two world wars, namely to avoid that more heritage could have been destroyed by human actions. UNESCO started small with just 20 members that originally ratified the documentation, and then it grew bigger and bigger to include nowadays 195 members. It also grew in its functions and responsibilities, considering that it started, as I said, just in order to forestall destruction, and now its objectives include education for every child, intercultural understanding and support for cultural diversity, scientific cooperation, and protecting freedom of expression. Focusing on UNESCO activities is important because it opens the road towards the inclusion of intangible cultural heritage into heritage debate. A decisive moment in the history of UNESCO's activity has been the ratification of the Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage in 1972. This was preceded by a series of operations that included mostly Egypt in its center. In 1954, the government of Egypt decided to build the new Aswan High Dam, whose reservoir of water would have eventually inundated part of the Nile Valley, which contained lots of cultural treasures of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia. In 1959, the governments of Egypt and Sudan asked UNESCO for help to rescue the endangered monuments and sites located in the valley. In the 1960, UNESCO launched an appeal to the international community to save the monuments of Nubia. This appeal resulted in the assistance from a number of countries such as Italy, Netherlands, Spain, and USA, and in the recovery of thousands of objects, as well as the salvage of a number of important temples. The campaign, which ended in 1980, was considered a major success. Those countries helped because those monuments were considered globally important not just for Egypt but for the whole humanity. The project cost 80 million, 40 of which were collected from 50 countries, and this led to other safeguarding campaigns. So this sort of international collaboration was replicated in order to try saving Venice and its lagoon in Italy, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, and many other cases. So UNESCO then initiated with the International Council of Monuments and Sites a draft convention to protect the common cultural heritage of humanity. So it was considered, and to institutionalize the international collaboration. And basically they understood that things should operate in a more systematic way with regards to international cooperation and the preservation of heritage of humanity. So since there were many heritage sites to be preserved that needed financial or organizational help from other countries, those countries themselves joined and organized to ratify the 1972 Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. This document identifies two categories of heritage: cultural and natural. The cultural heritage includes monuments of outstanding universal value from the point of view of history, art, or science, group of buildings because of their architectural, historical, artistic, or scientific value, and sites interesting from a historical, aesthetic, ethnological, or anthropological point of view. Natural heritage encompasses natural features of outstanding universal value from the aesthetic or scientific point of view, geological and physiographical formations which are the habitat of threatened species of animals and plants of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science or conservation, and natural sites of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science, conservation, or natural beauty. The convention works in this way. It confers to each member state the duty of ensuring the identification, protection, or conservation, and presentation and transmissions to future generations of the cultural and natural heritage. The places identified are then proposed to the World Heritage Committee, which is meant to decide if a nominee can be inscribed on the World Heritage list. In case of acceptance, this will be considered of international interest and provided with special assistance in terms of preservation. Nowadays, the list of natural and cultural heritage world sites keep growing and growing. So the list kept growing and growing, but then UNESCO delegates stumbled upon a conundrum. Most of the Asian and African heritage was immaterial, didn't have the hardware to show for it, to say in an engineering way. This means that in these countries, the important manifestations and legacy from the past that give meaning to people's lives and might be worthy of safeguarding and preservation were not in the form of buildings, towns, amphitheaters, or pyramids, but in the form of languages, oral history, traditions, social practices, craftsmanship, ceremonies, rituals, taboos, and forth on. So, what are the reasons for this conundrum, or in other words, why immaterial manifestations of cultural heritage were not originally considered? There may be a few reasons for this. One example is that for decades, heritage professionals had been equating heritage with the economic concept of public good that might suggest an explanation on how immaterial or intangible heritage, which cannot be easily interpreted through the concept of public goods, has not initially been considered as proper cultural heritage. Other scholars have offered a somewhat different commentaries, focusing on the historical tendency to look at heritage as a thing, a physical place, in a world in which that which is visible, concrete, takes precedence over that which is immaterial, and consistently so with the etymology of the word that we have seen before. And finally, these practices of neglecting immaterial heritage reflected an Occidental praxis, as in the West, most of the heritage had a tangible form to show. These two following quotes, respectively from Aikawa, Fowler, and Mungeri, so two non-Western UNESCO delegates, emphasize how the gap in recognition between tangible and intangible heritage has for a long time reflected an ethnocentric and Occidental praxis based on the fact that the Western world heritage is mostly based on tangible heritage, such as building, historic places, monuments, and artifacts. You can now pause the video to read the two quotes fully. As hopefully the two quotes showed, neglecting immaterial aspect in the process of preserving heritage started to become logically inconsistent as the work of the professionals of heritage developed. In some circumstances, UNESCO delegates found themselves unable to deal with keeping or ignoring all the set of particular knowledge and traditions associated with almost every physical place identified as cultural heritage. A good example is provided by this case study in Japan, and in fact it's been now for over a millennium that two wood-made shrine buildings being part of the Ise Grand Temple in Japan are wholly reconstructed by maintaining the identical structure every 20 years with fresh material from the same forest, partly in order to transmit the building techniques from a generation to another. In this case, the authenticity of heritage lies in the knowledge related to the construction, with respect to which the materiality of the temple is only a means to. It appears evident that cases like this embarrass the old and rigid tendency to equate heritage to something merely physical. Indeed, value and meaning given by people are an essential part of tangible heritage, to such a point that it could be said that tangible can only be understood through the intangible. So eventually, 21 years after the Convention for the Safeguarding of Tangible Heritage, a new convention was ratified by most nations. This is the way in which ICH was defined in the convention, and I highlighted in bold a few parts, as I'll talk a little more about those characteristics later. Here I show just two among many other examples of ICH that is included in the convention. These two are both from Italy, where I am from. On the left we have the Opera dei Pupi, which is a marionette theatrical performance, and on the right there is a new entry, which is the Neapolitan way of making pizza. So going back to the characteristics that I highlighted before and that make ICH very interesting for its complexity and for it being deeply integrated into human culture, activities, behaviors, and forth on. The literature identifies fluidity and inconsistency as characteristics of ICH. They stem from the fact that the different individuals always produce ICH differently in different times and spaces. The ways of reproduction of what is inherited from the past are extremely important to understanding the essence of ICH. Even if it can only exist if people keep it in existence by transmitting it from one generation to another, the contrary can also be true, on account of the fact that people obtain from a shared heritage a meaningful context for their social actions. In other words, community and heritage feed one another, the former by perpetuating customs and tradition to keep ICH alive, the latter by in turn giving life to the continuation of the community from a cultural standpoint. This ends up to form a sort of self-perpetuating cycle of community ICH. Another aspect to focus on pertains to the quality of such reproductions of ICH by people affiliated with it, as this is not a smooth process. Communities that are the entities that assure the viability of ICH are far from being monolithic entities. To the opposite, a community is a complex body composed of highly differentiated people. The differentiation can regard also the played role in terms of knowledge. Some people may not have knowledge that connects with the wider community's culture they are affiliated to, while others might even reject traditions and practices associated with their heritage. The descent is thus an accepted and predictable component of replicating ICH, in respect to which some practitioners can either play a beneficial or a detrimental role. As a consequence, heritage can be inherently dissonant and contested, within which even alternative positions can be reworked and included in a consensual version. Communities are thus the proper environment in which the meaning of heritage emerges and where it is transmitted and negotiated generation after generation. I want to close this presentation by stating that now that there are two conventions, one for tangible and one for intangible, if they are followed rigidly, one may end up conceptualizing differences and separations where there aren't. As we have seen with the example of the temple before, the Japanese temple, sometimes it's difficult to discern between the tangibility and the intangibility of cultural heritage, and which of the two forms should be preserved, because sometimes it's both. Both make heritage, not just the physical appearance and nor just the knowledge associated to it that may give it value, but both. The critical literature on cultural heritage states that its value is never intrinsic, but externally attributed to it. In fact, although tangible artifacts may have had value for people who built them or commissioned them, today, in order to receive a global acknowledgement, artifacts are never valuable per se, yet they, without exception, become precious after a process of evaluation by a professional gaze, be it from anthropologists, historians, or archaeologists. Such a not inherent nature of heritage challenges any attempt to separate tangible and intangible heritage because of the intangibility of both knowledge and authority that always determine cultural heritage. This just means that drawing rigid separation between tangible and intangible heritage is not a good idea. And there is an example that hopefully will show it more clearly. One of the most important names in heritage studies, Laura Jane Smith, stated all heritage must be considered intangible. Admiring the Colosseum in Rome would be equivalent to staring at the remaining of just an eccentrically shaped rock constructions without having many intangible historical and engineering notions which lead us to perceive it as an extremely important monument to preserve. In this sense, the tangible would be irrelevant without the human-based process of conferring meaning to it and, as a consequence, value. Even though the progressive recognition of those elements as part of heritage has led agents to separate intangible heritage from the material one, scholars have followed a different path by refusing the distinction on the grounds that we always refer to our emotions, memories, and knowledge than to the intangible, regardless of whether having to do with tangible or intangible artifacts. While this argument may sound too extreme for some commentators, as there surely are forms of heritage which manifest themselves predominantly in a tangible or intangible form, it should encourage to be careful when approaching the subject and avoid predetermined rigid categorization. This was all for this short lecture. Thank you for listening.